Welcome to the Right to Reason podcast. I am your host, Robert Stanley. Today we are having a gun debate. In addition, today, Beto O'Rourke, the popular anti-gun candidate who is known for his sick skateboarding skills in a fast food parking lot near you, dropped out of the presidential race.
Breaking news, Beto O'Rourke is dropping out of the Democratic presidential race on this Friday night. The former Texas congressman had a couple breakout moments and major fundraising initially, but he lost steam. That's according to him. His campaign announcing he, quote, doesn't have the means to continue on.
Why, Beto, does this keep happening in this country?
Kids, and it doesn't matter where I go in this country, tell me they are scared to go to school. They fear the future.
A lot of injury, a lot of suffering in El Paso right now. I'm incredibly saddened, and it is very hard to think about this.
For me, it really took listening to those families who had lost someone in El Paso, who had survived that mass shooting, to think that problem all the way through. I was talking about ending the sales of assault weapons, red flag laws, universal background checks. I'm now convinced that that is not enough. That if we do not take these guns off the streets where they already are, these are assault weapons and weapons of war, not only will we have more terror attacks like the ones we have, but more Americans will be living in terror. And in Odessa, I met the mother of a 15-year-old girl who was shot by an AR-15. And that mother watched her bleed to death over the course of an hour because so many other people were shot by that AR-15 in Odessa and Midland. There weren't enough ambulances to get to them in time. Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47. We're not going to allow it to be used against our fellow Americans anymore.
It's the Right to Reason podcast.
That's why, like, Beto wasn't smart, couldn't handle it. I told my wife, I said, see, it's not so easy. I told our great First Lady tonight, who people love, they love her. Oh, that poor bastard. Well, poor pathetic guy. He was pathetic. Remember the arms, a flail, and so on. Remember that? You know, he ran against Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz won. He spent almost $100 million. And Ted Cruz and I helped Ted, and we campaigned together, and it was good. But I used to watch him. Then when he came onto the really big stage, his crazy stage, I noticed he was flailing with the arms, and he was standing on tables. He was standing on countertops. I said, does he ever stand on the floor and speak? But he's waving his arms and going crazy. And I said, what the hell is he doing? What is he on? And you remember he made the statement that he was born for this. Anybody that says he was born for this, they're in trouble. You know, I used to have guys come into my office. Sir, I'm the greatest salesman. Nobody can sell. You know, the truth is, anybody that says they're a great salesman, usually they're not a very good salesman. It's true. It's those sneaky ones in the back that don't talk. That you don't know about. They're the ones. But Beto was nasty. And he said that he was born for it. Like he was born from heaven. He came down. And if that's the case, some really bad things happened because he made a total fool out of himself. And he came out of Texas, the great state of Texas. He came out of Texas, a very hot political property, and he went back as cold as you can be. So he was a nasty guy, but he had a couple of policies that don't work well in the state of Texas, right? He was against religion. He was against you having a gun. And he was against oil. So you come from Texas, You don't like religion, you don't like oil, and you don't have guns. I don't know, that's not a good combination in the state of Texas. That's not good in Mississippi either. I don't know, is that good? Is that good anyway? No, he went back home to Texas. And hopefully we won't be hearing about him for a long time. It's amazing how cold he can get so quickly. But he's a nasty guy.
This episode of the Right to Reason podcast is brought to you by our patrons and contributors like me. We have all recognized the value of the unrestrained marketplace of ideas and have decided to make a difference. You can make a difference too. Contribute at patreon.com/right and learn more about your right to reason at therighttoreason.com. Your activism is appreciated.
Damn. Ooh. Big Steel Chronicles. I smack nuns on the ass and mass at the confession. I'm sticking up the altar boys with Smith & Wessons.
And today we're talking with Owen Younger from the Skeptical Texans. That's at skepticaltexans.org. And also Michael Michalski. I'm so happy to have you guys here with us.
Hey, happy to be here.
Happy to be here.
You're both kind of gun enthusiasts, as it were. Would that be a fair way to describe you?
Yeah, I think so.
I don't know how much of a gun enthusiast I am, but I'm definitely pro-gun rights. It's actually pretty ironic, as pro-gun as I am. This summer was the first time I actually shot some guns, but I definitely defend people's right to own and fire weapons.
And then Owen, it's so weird because Owen, you're the liberal and you've got a bunch of guns. It's kind of it's a weird setup, man.
I joke with people that I'm a liberal in a place where it matters. I live in a suburb of Dallas, Texas, so I'm in just about the reddest of red states. I've only been a liberal about 5 years. My political shift is sort of something that's humorous to a bunch of my friends because friends I've known since college who've watched me sort of evolve politically. I'm very much a liberal, even a progressive, even an advocate for social justice issues. But the last vestige of my former sort of political self was, or is, I continue to be a gun owner, and I joke that I haven't always been a liberal, but I've been a Texan my entire life, and I got my first firearm given to me as a Christmas present when I was 8 years old, and I've owned guns ever since, and I have not one but two safes full of them in my home, and I won't talk about the number of firearms that I own, but it's a large number. I have guns in one of the safes that I've never fired and probably never will, not for any reason other than I bought them because it seemed like a cool idea at the time many years ago, and I just don't really shoot that often anymore. But I am a Texas handgun licensee, so I'm saying this now kind of on the air, as it were. I don't talk about this much in the free thought community, but I most of the time when I'm outside of my home and people see me, I'm usually carrying a concealed firearm. It's legal for me to do that, and I've been doing that for more than 20 years. I was in sort of the first set of people to acquire a Texas concealed handgun license, which they used to be called. The year that law was enacted, I was in college. And I was old enough at the time. I was over 21, and so I've been carrying a firearm as a sort of a normal thing most of my adult life. And so, as a liberal, even a progressive, that's something that kind of puts me at odds. I'm conflicted about that, what to do about firearms, and I've talked about it with my wife. And is it time perhaps to start divesting the collection? Is it time to start thinking about doing something like that? I don't know. But what I will say is I recognize the problem, and I recognize and see gun culture for what it is because I've spent decades as a part of it, and it is problematic. And the question at hand then is what we do about that. And I think maybe that's where Michael and I maybe can have a good conversation and even some good disagreement today.
I'd be curious to see where you guys end up with just simple regulation stuff. But either way,
Sure.
Owen, you sound like a real monster. I wanted to play this clip from Jim Jeffries.
Now, before I start saying this, I want to say this, right? I believe in your right as Americans to have guns. I'm not trying to stop you from having guns. All I'm saying is this is my personal belief on the opinion. My opinion on the it doesn't matter. I don't like guns, right? I'm going to say some things that are just facts, right? In Australia, we had guns. right? Right up until 1996. And in 1996, Australia had the biggest massacre on earth. Still hasn't been beaten. And now, after that, they banned the guns. Now, in the 10 years before Port Arthur, there was 10 massacres. Since the gun ban in 1996, there hasn't been a single massacre since. I don't know how or why this happened. Maybe it was a coincidence, right? Now, please understand that I understand that Australia and America are two vastly different cultures with different people, right? I get it. In Australia, we had the biggest massacre on earth, and the Australian government went, "That's it, no more guns." And we all went, "Yeah, right then, that seems fair enough." Now, in America, you have the Sandy Hook massacre where little tiny children died, and your government went, "Maybe we'll get rid of the big guns?" And 50% of you went, "Fuck you, don't take my guns!" So here's where it gets confusing, right? Now, as I said, I'm all for your Second Amendment rights. I think you should be able to have guns. It's in your Constitution. What I am not for is bullshit arguments and lies. There is one argument and one argument alone for having a gun, and this is the argument. Fuck off. I like guns. It's not the best argument, but it's all you've got.
So, Michael, would you agree with Jim Jeffries there that really the only argument to be pro-gun is just that I like guns?
That's definitely not the only argument, and that's not an argument. That's a matter of taste. The argument for having guns is more of a political one, in that gun equals force, and those who are capable of wielding force are those who have real political power, is what it ultimately boils down to.
There are examples all over the world of countries that don't have guns, and they're democracies. And
let me stop you. Let me stop you 1 second.
Well, but it's so let me finish. Their government doesn't take advantage of them. Their government doesn't really abuse them. They are perhaps many of them more homogenous than the United States, and I would concede that. But I think that there are plenty of examples of countries in the world where people are not politically disempowered simply because they're disarmed. And denying that is denying reality. So I'll let you respond.
Well, of course, in like a pragmatic, realistic sense, you're right. But what I'm saying, I'm arguing it on a theoretical sense. There's not a single country in the world that was formed without guns. It's just a question of who has the guns, right? And so the standard idea is that we separate people into civilians and military. And military people can have guns, or police officers can have guns, but civilians can't. Now, you have a situation in America, for example, where police officers are abusing their power more and more. So in my mind, it's kind of silly to say, well, normal people can't have guns, but the cops should have guns, even though cops are killing innocent people who don't have guns.
Just purely as a matter of history, most nations on the planet existed before there was such a thing as a firearm. So the boundaries of the Republic of France, for example, may sort of be more modern, but the people who occupy the area that is France today and who think of themselves as French 500 or 600 or 700 years ago, before there were firearms, those people were there and they called themselves France. So your argument is not, I think, that guns are necessary to create a country. I think your argument is that some force or some political upheaval was necessary in order to form a country, and that might or might not be true. But I don't. Forgive me for arguing that the practical reality of the world is more important than the philosophical nature of the conversation about firearms. As a practical reality, roughly 40,000 Americans are killed by guns every year, and guns are the cause of that. You can parade out any trope that you want. Guns don't kill people; people kill people. That may be true, but when you take the guns away, you take away the deaths, and I can prove that by pointing at Australia, by pointing at Japan, by pointing at Canada, by pointing at any number of modern Western democratic countries who are sort of peer countries to the United States that don't have the problems with gun violence that we have. And I just don't see any way around the argument. Guns are a problem. The question is, what do you do about it?
Guns are not the problem. The problem is people who have ill will and malevolent intent. That's the problem. The problem is a lack of morality within a country or a culture. Now, guns don't kill people. People kill people. Well, force kills people. You said, you take away the guns, you take away the deaths. No, you take away the deaths by gun. People will still die through bludgeoning, through fights, through poisoning, through explosions. People will die in car accidents. People will die from drug overdose. People will die from natural disasters. And if you want to talk about reality, the reality is people suffer and die. And that's the world we live in. Like you were saying, okay, that countries existed before guns. Fair enough. But it's all about ability to use force and the right of people to self-defense. So the only way a country can be formed is if that country can defend its own borders. And the only way an individual has any rights or any existence as an individual is if that individual has a right to self-defense. Now, if you take an individual's gun away, what you're saying is you don't have a right to self-defense, or we will limit your right to self-defense because we don't trust you. And that's something that I have a problem with because in general, I trust people.
Okay. So I just sort of muddled. Are you suggesting that the people of Canada who don't have the right to own a firearm to the same degree that, or let's pick Australia because that's the example that we started with. Are you suggesting that the people in Australia are unable to defend themselves?
Potentially they would be less capable of defending themselves if, let's say, Australia, like if Australia were invaded versus if the U.S. were invaded, the U.S. would be much better at defending itself.
So you're sort of burden shifting here. The claim that you made before was that if you take away somebody's gun, you take away their ability to defend themselves. And so to evaluate whether you're correct or not, I'm asking whether the people in Australia are suffering from being attacked, and they're not. In fact, they've solved a significant degree of their gun violence by what people in the sort of firearms community in the United States call the Australia solution, the total ban, and that solved their problem. Now, I'm not really advocating in the United States that we go toward an Australia solution, but there are a lot of very intelligent voices in this country that are arguing precisely that. I do think we need some. I think there's a place for common sense laws to apply. I don't think the Second Amendment is absolute in the same way that the First Amendment is definitely also not absolute. There are constraints around speech. There are constraints around the press, and there are plenty of good examples about that. And I think that good, sound firearm policy around controlling who has access to guns is not just a good idea. I think it's almost a moral imperative. Would you agree with me, Michael, that we need better gun control laws?
I don't know. I don't think we need better gun control laws. I think we need a more educated population that knows how to use guns. And but like, what would be your policy positions? What do you think we should change?
So I don't think that there are any easy solutions. The United States, I'll agree, is an entirely different animal than most of the rest of the world. Guns are part of the culture here, and I accept that. So as a practical reality, I accept that there's roughly one firearm in America for every person who lives in America. That, as a statistic, that's a very interesting statistic. I happen to own my unfair share of them, and I'm willing to admit that. So I I own enough guns for more than a couple of households of people. But with 40,000 gun deaths a year, I think there's something that we've got to do about that. Just as a parallel statistic, do either of you know how many Americans died in the Vietnam War? No. 57,000 American soldiers were killed in Vietnam. Wow. Almost that many Americans die from gun violence every year. So, wow. Michael, for you to say that people are still going to die in car accidents, people are still going to be bludgeoned, people are still going to be attacked or whatever, the statistics actually completely crush what you said. The statistics say that first and foremost, the presence of a gun increases aggression on the part of the person who possesses that firearm. You see that study after study after study demonstrates that the presence of a firearm increases the aggression of the firearm holder. The Wayne LaPierre, so in full disclosure, as a vestige of my former political self, I'm a former conservative. And from many, many years ago, I still have a life membership in the NRA. When Wayne LaPierre says that an armed society is a polite society, he's full of shit. That's actually not true. Armed people are more aggressive than unarmed people. And when we look at the world, we see Canada, we see Australia, we see Europe, where firearm ownership among civilians is not prevalent. And we see perfectly normal people behaving in perfectly normal ways and not killing each other. So I would assert that, on the contrary, the presence of a firearm is more likely to cause violence, and that you are not going to have 30,000 people a year commit suicide by gun and that's also a true statistic. Roughly 2/3 of gun deaths in every year are actually suicides. And we find that when we examine attempts at suicide by various methods, they almost always fail if they're not by gun, and they almost always succeed if they're by gun. So if you take the gun away, the suicides are not successful. You also look at people who are suffering from depression. 90% of people who attempt suicide and fail never attempt suicide again. It was a brief moment in their life when they were suffering from depression, and they lived and they managed to recover and they managed to get their life under control. So I would assert, on the contrary, the facts actually show that the firearm increases the lethality of the suicide attempt, and therefore it makes it more likely that people are going to die. If you take the guns away, you're going to reduce that number dramatically. And I think the facts are pretty clear about that.
Okay. Now, I'm not very versed in the statistics or the research or the stuff you presented there, and my argument isn't really an argument from statistics or an argument from, well, whatever the research shows this or scientists have found that. To give you a little counterexample, and this isn't research or anything. My father, he didn't own a gun for the majority of his life. When he got a little bit older, he decided he wants to buy guns, so he bought a bunch of guns. He has not been more aggressive or less aggressive. He's still the same guy. So, guns increase aggressiveness. Okay, if I think these were aggressive people to begin with, and yeah. But you're talking about, suicide victims. That's an interesting divergence, and I don't know if we want to go this route. But this is an argument I've had with people before. And I understand it's a pretty extreme position, but I think people should have the right to commit suicide. I think it's pretty ludicrous that suicide is illegal. The bottom line is that if you're trying to protect people, from themselves, that is, I think, an ineffective way to go about politics ultimately. Now, you're saying something like Australia's successful. Australia's successful so far. It's been, 20 years? That's a very short-term approach. Look at, for example, what's happening in Hong Kong. Look at what's happening in China, where people have no rights whatsoever. I think at some point it might be useful for them to have guns. If you're looking at a short-term statistics, it might very well turn out that guns will decrease the amount of homicides or the amount of suicides or whatever. Stricter gun laws, but my question still remains: is what do you think is we should change in our gun laws?
So I've struggled with this because I start with the premise that this really is a constitutional question. Whether we like it or not, whether my fellow liberals agree with me or not, the Second Amendment, as of the Heller decision, if y'all are familiar with that Supreme Court decision from the prior decade, the Heller decision, the opinion of the court was written by Scalia, who else, and he basically said yes. Contained within the Second Amendment is an individual right to bear arms. Now, he agreed with the dissenters on the court that right was not unrestricted, and I think that's true of any of the rights that are given in the Bill of Rights. None of them are absolute, but whether we like it or not, as a political reality, the Second Amendment gives an individual right to bear arms. The hazards of gun ownership are things that should compel us to sober reflection, and so a couple of more sort of statistics for you. the chance of being struck by lightning is roughly 1 in 15,000. The chance of being killed in a mass shooting is roughly 1 in 11,000. So mass shootings, even though they are headline-grabbing problems that scare people, and that's the kind of fear that drives political action. I think we should probably be a little more measured in the things we try to do, and not base our policy decisions on fear. But I will say this: the average American in his or her lifetime has about a 1 in 300 chance of being shot and killed, and that right there is a pretty scary number. That's certainly a more important statistic than the 1 in 11,000 chance of dying in a mass shooting. Here's what I think should happen. If I had my preference, I would see the following construct rolled out in the United States. I would see mandatory national licensing to buy a firearm. I would see a
regulated
closure.
and
I'm sorry.
You're saying mandatory licensing that's managed on the federal level, regulated and managed on the federal level?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So federal licensing, okay.
Yeah. I would see a nationwide registry of firearms created, and that registry would allow in the common parlance in the media, it's referred to as the gun show loophole, but that's a misnomer. It's actually a private sale loophole. There's nothing that would stop me from selling one of my privately owned firearms to Robert and not doing any paperwork on that. Robert wouldn't have to do a background check or have a waiting period or anything like that. He'd hand me the cash and I'd hand him a gun and we'd be done. I would close that ability, and I would once the registry was in place, everyone would have to comply with background check requirements, and once the firearm changed hands, there would be reporting requirements to the agency that tracked them, whatever. And then I would add something onto that. I would like for people who have this firearm license to be subjected to periodic psychological exams. I'm a professional pilot, and whether I like it or not, every 6 months I have to submit myself to an FAA doctor who evaluates my physical fitness to fly an airplane. And so it would be sort of a mental health checkup or a mental health physical or something like that, where people who own firearms, if you want to have a firearm, you have the right to have that. But under this construct that I have in mind, you'd have to have someone sort of review your mental health and have a conversation with you and check on you, and you'd have to have that renewed every 2 or 3 years, something like that. And then the last component of this I would advocate for would be the mandatory safety inspections. The same agency that would or somebody similar would have the right to come and inspect the way you store your firearms and ensure that they're secured from children or unauthorized access or whatever. And I think if we could do those things, I think that would significantly alleviate a lot of the problems we have out there. I also think that there probably should be in this construct that I have in mind. It'll never happen. The way I'm proposing this will never happen. But there would also be some way for family or friends or acquaintances, somebody who sees behavior that's worrying, and then goes to this agency and says, "Look, I'm concerned that so and so person has a gun license, but they've really been acting erratically lately. Can you go check on them?" And having a court or someone issue a warrant or something to go, physically compel that person to an evaluation. And, if the court finds probable cause, kind of like getting a search warrant or something like that, they'd issue a warrant that says, until you receive treatment or something, we're pulling your firearm license. You're going to have to surrender your firearm to some local authority. And that right there, I think, is a construct that would help us achieve a significant reduction in firearm violence. The problem is that the NRA is never going to stand for that. And I know you're going to disagree with me, so I've been talking for a while. I'll give the floor back to you.
So you're basically, forgive me for straw manning your argument, but you're basically in favor of tattletaling. You're saying that, people should have the right to report on each other to some government agency that's going to be controlling everything. Like in today's, especially in today's society where everybody gets offended by everything and every little thing is a sign of mental illness, this is a very, very dangerous thing. And I would suggest you or anybody else who's considering such proposals think twice about that, because that is just, wow. To me, that is just anti-liberty. That is anti my core being. Like, when I have a problem with another person, the last thing I look to is to go to the authorities, to go to tell teacher or tell daddy. Like, I'm all for solving my own problems, okay? So that would be the first thing I would say regarding this reporting. Oh, somebody's acting suspiciously, you better go check them out. Like, and then here, let me give you just another example that happened just recently, and it was a big thing on Reddit, on Twitter, I think, where a neighbor, and I think this happened in Texas too, where somebody had their door open early in the morning, like 4 or 5 in the morning, and the neighbor saw it, and they called the police to do like a safety check, go check them out. The cops come and they shoot the woman in her home. Like, come on, like this opens the door to so much abuse. This type of, oh, let's report them and let's have the authorities check and make sure I'm safe. In my opinion, my safety is my responsibility, no one else's. But another big problem with this is if you're talking about creating a registry on the national level or on the federal level or federal licensing, a big problem with government is, or with any institution really, is the more you centralize it, the more it becomes inefficient and opens itself up for corruption, right? So like, why does it have to be on a federal level? Can't we do this on a local or state level?
The police shooting that you're talking about happened in Fort Worth, so it hits pretty close to home. The police officer in that case was definitely wrong and has been arrested and charged.
He's a murderer. He's a murderer. Let's call a spade a spade. The dude's a murderer.
We agree. I have to agree with you. Apropos of nothing whatsoever, he didn't even identify himself as a police officer before he fired. It's unconscionable.
Exactly. He just shot the woman in her home.
I agree. There's no excuse for that. But I have this other observation that I want to make to you. The motto of the United States Department of Homeland Security is, if you see something, say something. They even have that. They even have those words trademarked. If you like, they really do. Go out to their website. If you see something, say something. And that's all I'm talking about. I'm not talking about some Animal Farm sort of Orwellian informing on your neighbor. That's not what I'm talking about. But if we see erratic behavior, if I see somebody that appears to be driving while intoxicated when I'm on the road, I'm going to call the local police department and say, hey, I think there's a driver at such and such here, and they're swerving all over the road. They look like they're intoxicated. You probably want to try and check that out. And you might call that tattletale culture, but I call that being a responsible citizen. So maybe we have a difference in opinion there. But I think what I'm proposing is actually responsible and not irresponsible. And I apologize. I think you'd asked me a question, and I think I talked 2 or 3 things without answering your question.
Sure. We can stick on this topic. I remember what my question is, but we can stick on this topic for a little bit because I think it's interesting.
Sure. Sure.
See, like, yeah, of course you're not. Nobody's ever going to propose like a Gestapo style report your neighbors thing. But how do you think those things start? Like, that's all I'm saying is you're opening the door for some really potential dangers, like huge dangers to our liberty, and not just liberty in terms of owning guns, but just liberty in general. I mean, these periodic psychological exams, like a registry where there's a database. Like, these things can be used against people, and this type of thing happens already, where people are blackmailed because of something they said, and it happens to be written down somewhere. You have a psych exam, and maybe it's somebody has a vendetta against you, and so they report you. They send a psychologist to your house. The psychologist deems, because maybe they were bribed or whatever, deems that you're mentally unfit to own a gun, and maybe that information gets leaked to your employer. Maybe you lose your job, stuff like that. It's like this would be my main argument with proposals like this, that you're how would you say it? You're threatening a person's autonomy. You're encroaching upon their privacy, essentially. So that to me is just. It's just really, really dangerous, really scary, and yeah.
So, yeah, I don't think the sky's falling. I think that the nature of the firearm risk is unique, and so I don't have any problem with responsible laws or
Right.
regulatory
But
frameworks.
here's the thing: you are responsible. You are a responsible person. But many people are not responsible, particularly people in positions of power, in political positions. People get into political power because they're losers in real life. That's kind of my little pet theory. But there's a lot of people who are corrupt in this world, and creating such agencies and such databases and tools to encroach into people's private lives just because they want to have a gun, just because I like to hunt, or maybe I live on a ranch and the closest sheriff is 200 miles away, and I'd like to have a gun to protect myself. Like, now I have to be registered, and I have to check with somebody. I have to ask permission for everything. Nobody sets up programs like this with the intent of them having unintended consequences, but they always do. And every time the government is of such a nature that if you give them an inch, they take a mile, that you start these things and they're supposed to be good, but they end up causing a lot of unnecessary damage, blowback, encroachments into our privacy. And I don't believe that responsible people should need to ask for permission from the government, where the people that they're asking permission from are often less responsible than they are.
Let's look at another right in the Bill of Rights. Let's go to the First Amendment and let's look at the right of a free press. I do not have the right to go start a television station without going to the FCC and getting a license. So we're already in a place where another guaranteed right there in the First Amendment has a regulatory framework around it and an entire agency for governance and oversight. And that's all I'm talking about here is building another.
Okay. Do you think the FCC is good for public communication and public discourse? Do you think it's helped us?
I think that having control around use of the public airways is a good idea. Yeah, I do. I absolutely do. Incidentally, I hold several FCC licenses, some of them for professional reasons, and I'm also a ham radio operator. So that's really all I'm talking about, is building a framework around something that's unique and about America, and unique in terms of public risk in America. And I don't want to belabor this too much more, but I think that sort of a psychological evaluation of gun owners, I think licensing, I think a mandatory national registration. And to your point, yeah, I think that it has to be at the national level. I don't think you can do this across states individually inside states. I think safety inspections, I think all of these things could help fix the problems. And I'll add this thought to you, that if conservatives, if Second Amendment advocates don't, and the NRA don't at some point start to get behind this idea that there needs to be more responsible control of firearms in society, I think that what's going to happen is that the public is going to grow more and more and more afraid of firearms. The truth of this situation is that most guns in America, even though there's about one gun for every citizen in the United States or every person in the United States, most gun owners own several, which means the majority of the population don't own guns at all. And I think those people could take it or leave it. And at some point, the political landscape is going to change. The Republicans have sort of a lock on the Supreme Court right now after Kavanaugh. The Roberts Court is definitely leaning more conservative in a lot of ways. But the tenure of the conservatives on the Supreme Court is going to come to an end because America is becoming more and more blue. And whether this happens 50 years from now or 100 years from now, I don't know. But at some point, the political landscape will have changed enough that I think people will decide it's time to try to pass an Australia solution that completely bans guns. So if conservatives don't get behind something now, it doesn't have to be as much as I'm proposing here. I realize I'm proposing a lot of things that are giving you heartburn, and maybe a lot of other gun advocates. But if gun advocates don't get behind doing something that's reasonable now, I think that the political game is going to take away the option. At some point, there will be enough people in America who will want to amend the Constitution, who will want to delete the Second Amendment, and then all bets are off. Then it is Australia, and at that point, I can't help you. But what I'm doing now is trying to be a responsible voice that says, okay, I get it. let's at least build something that works inside the constitutional framework to try and solve a problem and generate peace between the NRA and gun supporters and gun control groups.
So what you're saying,
No, I'm just saying if responsible gun owners don't start to do this now, I think at some point, I don't know when it's going to be, but 50 or 100 years from now, the Second Amendment is at risk. It absolutely is.
Yeah, so you're saying in order to save gun rights, we need to limit gun rights. I get it. It's smart. But it's not okay. It's not that it just gives me heartburn, man. It's that it undermines my humanity, and it undermines the humanity and individual liberty of people. It takes away people's nobility and right to be who they are. You're talking about essentially sanitizing things, because your example of the FCC is fantastic, because the FCC is bullshit. It's fucking nonsense. Like, TV is unwatchable. I haven't watched TV in a long time, and sometimes I'll watch some football and I'll see like commercials for stuff, and it's just laughably whitewashed. It's nothing. Nothing of substance can be said on TV anymore because it's deemed offensive by the FCC. Fuck that shit. Thank God for the internet where we could have this podcast. Look, if not for the internet and its unregulated space, you and I wouldn't be able to have this conversation, because nobody would allow us on an FCC-controlled station. In particular, my views, which happen to be a little bit extreme, and I realize that. But I think people have the right to express their views. And so if you're advocating for creating something like the FCC when it comes to guns, what you're advocating for is just fuck it. Let's get rid of the Second Amendment altogether, because that's where it's headed anyway. And then if you're saying if it's a political inevitability, then okay, there's nothing we can do. But I don't think it's a political inevitability. I completely disagree with you that the United States is turning blue. In fact, there's a huge political paradigm shift going on right now, and the old conservative liberal lines are going to fail. It's going to be completely different in the coming decades, and definitely not the world of the 90s where the FCC controlled everything. And thank God for that. So I completely disagree with you that we're going to have to get rid of the Second Amendment. Definitely not.
So we disagree. First, the observation that I think the reason that you dislike advertisements, or the reason that you dislike the programming on TV is because you don't occupy the same place in the market that most Americans do. I think the market is driving that. The is not censoring ideas from TV stations. That's not really what's happening.
It's completely censoring it. It's saying that certain words are not allowed. As soon as you say that certain words are not allowed, what you're effectively doing is censoring ideas. You're censoring the ability to express themselves.
Carlin's Big Seven. Well, okay.
Exactly.
The fact that you didn't hear someone on primetime TV that's not a cable network, but that's broadcast over the air say fuck. I don't think that's the reason that you dislike advertisements on TV. But anyway, let me ask you this. Let me take this in a different direction. So I've given you an example of the kinds of things that I think would be reasonable new laws or a new regulatory framework around firearms. Is there anything you'd be willing to see? Do you feel like there could be some improvement in the body of control around firearms?
The solution, if I were to implement any type of solution, it would be more of the Swiss model, where I would say that I would take the complete opposite approach and say everybody ought to be trained in the use of firearms. It should be like a mandatory high school course or something, so that everybody knows how to deal with guns, even how to be safe around guns, how to load, unload, clean, and all that stuff, and then how to fire and fire a gun accurately. I think that would make people behave more safely with guns, because right now everybody has this kind of Yahoo! I have a gun, I can go shoot. Like, we need to teach people that having a gun is a deadly weapon. It's not a toy. It's not something you get drunk and you fire off rounds in your backyard. Like, something like that, I think, would go a long way to helping. I'm not against licensing. I think it shouldn't be done on the federal level. Yeah, but like doing like periodic psychological exams, or this, your family can report you if they see that something's wrong. That's just wow. That is way too much for me. But I mean, licensing. I come from a state, from Illinois, where we have firearms license. It's the FOID card, and people come down from Wisconsin to the gun shops there, and they're kind of confused, like, what the hell is a FOID card? So I'm not against that. And while I'm on the topic, to give you kind of a counter example, you're saying, making guns illegal would make things safer. Take a look at Chicago. Chicago has some of the strictest gun laws in the nation, yet it has some of the highest homicide rates. How do you explain that?
Switzerland first. Switzerland has a local issuance of firearm license. You have to have a license, and they keep a registry. Switzerland's got a registry. The firearm model in Switzerland is actually not a bad example, and they have some of the things in place that I'm talking about. They don't do a national level license. They're local, as I understand it. But that additional regulation doesn't bother me. The question about Chicago is sort of a non sequitur. I'm not saying that strict gun laws solve the problem. I'm saying taking all the guns away from everybody solves the problem. The question is, what do we do in the current environment? Obviously, there is a true statement. If you outlaw guns, then only outlaws will own guns. I mean, that's a true statement, and I get that. The question is, what can we do as a productive, responsible body of citizenry to try and broach that problem, to try and get to that problem? And the answer is, I think that there are things we can do that are better than what we're doing now, and I'm at least willing to be a party to the conversation that says, sure, I think there are constraints and limits on owning guns, just as I think there are constraints and limits on speech. I'm not allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater. There are things that I'm not allowed to do, even though free speech is very important to me. And so I'm willing, as a gun owner, and maybe more importantly as a liberal, to try and have this conversation and see what better outcomes we can find.
You say that you understand that fact, but I don't think that you do. That if you outlaw things, only outlaws have guns. How well has the war on drugs worked? It doesn't work. The thing is, even if you outlaw guns, you're just going to create a black market. You're just going to fuel more criminals, just like what happened with Prohibition in the 1920s. It created the mafia and Al Capone, and problems that we have to deal with till today. This is one of the reasons why, for example, I'm morally against abortion, but I will never be a proponent of making abortion illegal. I just think that we should educate people and give them as many options as possible, and try to persuade people through nonviolent means to not have abortions, and to understand that killing your baby is an evil thing. Now, if we make it illegal, then what's going to happen is it's going to create these backdoor, back alley abortion clinics where people are just getting hurt. The same thing's going to happen with drugs, and the same thing's going to happen with guns if you limit them too much, or if you try to make them illegal. I think that at the end of the day, like when I'm talking about Switzerland, and you said, I'm not familiar with the details, but what I know is that most people are armed in Switzerland, or like military service is mandatory, and basically everybody is trained in how to use a gun. And that would be a society that I think would be much better, because we would be stronger as people. I would rather live in a world where everybody has a concealed carry weapons than a world where only the cops have weapons, and I have to if I get assaulted by a criminal, I have to wait for the police to arrive. I'd rather have that gun. I'd rather my neighbor has a gun, and the people I'm with that are good people are capable of defending themselves. And this holds true on an individual criminal level. This also holds true if, let's say, the country is invaded by a foreign power. Now, this is not the case for the United States now, because it's the world's superpower, but it may not always be the case, and it's better to have guns than not have them.
So, I don't want to agree with you too much. I think that in certain in certain contexts, firearm ownership is positive and can be seen that way historically. The Ku Klux Klan, for example, was created as a means of disarming former soldiers who were African American and ensuring that they had no firearms. And the presence of firearms in the hands of the disenfranchised has sometimes been a positive in history. I no less a liberal thinker than Sam Harris has argued that as an absolute moral imperative, a woman having access to a firearm is inherently moral because it helps equalize the physical strength difference between men and women, and reduces the likelihood that a woman might suffer from violence. And I get that. I mean, that speaks to me, and I get that. But the fact that Australia was able to implement a solution and to achieve a dramatic reduction in all gun crime and significantly in gun deaths is instructive. I think that can be achievable. Now, is that the path that we want to take here? I don't think so. I think culture in the United States is different, but I do think that there are things that we can do that might be better choices than we're making now. I just hope that responsible voices help figure out what those things should be. And mark my words, you scoff at this, but I'm telling you, the political landscape in the United States is changing, and what is liberal now is becoming more and more popular, and there will be a time, I think, when the United States advances enough politically to put the Second Amendment at risk. And I think firearms advocates, particularly in the conservative side of this argument, should pay heed. You do not have a lock on the Supreme Court, and more than that, you don't have a lock on the Constitution. It can be changed, and if the political landscape changes enough, I think the Second Amendment is probably the most at risk of the amendments.
Well, that's why I have a gun, because if the political landscape changes too much, I can start a revolution and start my own country and write a new constitution.
Gentlemen, thank you so much.
There you go. I enjoyed it. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, and thank you for putting up my crassness.
No, it's good.
Michael Michalski, I really appreciate you joining us today. And anybody can find Owen Younger's work at theskepticaltexans.org. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you very much.
Listen to the wind blow, watch the sun.
Thank you to Michael and Owen. Thank you to Dave Blair at davefreesong.com/free music. Thank you to our patrons. You can also support this broadcast at patreon.com/right and learn more at therighttoreason.com. Next week is a little up in the air, and that's how life goes sometimes. Gotta be flexible. But between now and then, whatever happens on this broadcast or in your week, remember that you need to believe in yourself. I forget that sometimes. And remember that you have the right to reason. I agree with Owen. But I also I agree with Mike on a lot of the critiques. What I liked about this convo is neither of you were going that far route of like Owen didn't say, let's just take all the guns. Fuck you, what if somebody comes in my house and they had the gun you didn't take? I want to have a gun. I care more about my kids than you do, obviously. But in that that's how I always feel when somebody's like, just take them all. You know, my thing, and what Mike didn't say, I think we should have more guns. Let's put guns in all the elementary schools. And, nobody was going extreme. It was a very reasonable conversation. It's I really... When I say thanks, on the thing, I mean that.
I'm usually brilliant, but on podcasts, I'm very handsome. That doesn't come from on podcasts.